Number 3, the Book of Revelation, First Quarter, 2019, Jon Paulien.
God's people in cities in the Book of Revelation. Dr. Jon Paulien is our moderator, and John of Pasco is going to do the opening prayer.
Kind Heavenly Father, thank you so much that Teresa and I could be here gathering with the saints and remember the times when we used to sit here at Graham's feet. And we so much appreciate the tradition that Gary and Sherry and John and Daniel and all have followed so that we can continue to enjoy a reminder of those wonderful times and a taste of times to come. Be with us as we again talk about you and the message that you have from John. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, this is the third in a series on the book of Revelation, and the title is God's People in Cities, and it's basically focusing on chapters 2 and 3 in the book of Revelation, which are messages to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, to Ephesus and Smyrna and Pergamum and Thyatira and Sardis and Philadelphia and Laodicea. Pick up your handout, and number 1, you will see it says, compare Jesus' self-introduction to each of the 7 churches with everything that is said about him in chapter 1. What are the implications of the fact that each church gets a partial and different picture of Jesus? So in order to bring this home, Terry, I'd like you to read, first of all, Revelation 1, 12 through 20. And then we're going to read a verse from each of the 7 churches. So Revelation 1, 12 to 20, we looked at it in the previous lesson, but now we want to repeat it because each of the 7 churches is introduced with elements from this vision. So listen carefully with that in mind.
Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands I saw one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe, and with a golden sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white, as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining with full force. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he placed his right hand on me, saying, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, and the living one. I was dead, and see, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now write what you have seen, what is, and what is to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
All right, now there you have this glorious picture of Jesus. Counting the previous lesson, we've now read it perhaps 3 times, and now comes the payoff. All right, let's go to chapters 2 and 3, and I will give Terry a series of texts from each of the 7. All right, first of all, let's read chapter 2, verse 1.
To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands.
All right, so this is drawn from the picture, right? Jesus is the one walking among the lampstands and holding 7 stars in his hand, all right? So Jesus introduces himself to Ephesus with features of that original vision. All right, verse 8.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life.
Okay, that reminds us of verse 18. He's the first and the last, the one who died and rose again. Verse 12.
And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, These are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword.
All right. Sharp two-edged sword was part of that vision, wasn't it? Coming out of his mouth. Now, notice verse 2 of chapter 2. It opens up with, I know your works. And then verse 9, I know your afflictions and your poverty. And then verse 13, I know where you live. Yeah. And verse 19, I know your deeds. Okay. So do you see the connection between those two? Jesus knows each church, and he approaches each church differently. What does that tell us about God? David?
He meets us where we are.
God meets us where we are. I like to say that that's the clearest, singular, most clear teaching of the Bible that's never said in so many words. It's just illustrated. God meets people where they are. Each church is different. He knows each church. He comes to each church differently. He meets them where they are. Terry?
But following through with that, he's flexible. Well, he's not inflexible. He can and does work with people in ways that they understand, in ways that apply to their current experience in life. I understand things now that were said to me years ago that made absolutely no sense. Somehow, we need the experience of life in order to put things together, to put the picture together as a whole, to file them in the drawer where they belong. And God doesn't say to us, well, I told you, and that's it. If you don't get it, well, too bad. He keeps working with us, and he moves with us as our experience grows.
Mm-hmm. So God meets the churches where they are. Now, what are the implications then that no church has the whole picture? None of these churches gets the whole picture. They all get just a piece, one or two, or at the most 3 elements from the vision of chapter 1. But that vision has a dozen or more elements. What is the implication that no church has the whole picture? Dave?
You can't sit on your laurels because you don't have the whole picture. So you need to keep searching. You need to keep working on that relationship so that you get to know him better, because if you stagnate, you die.
Is that true of Pineknoll? I thought we had the whole picture.
I don't know anybody here that has openly said that.
Okay. But it's good to remind ourselves, isn't it? Because I think when you come together and you have a certain sense as a group, a vision, a sense of what God is trying to accomplish, the temptation can become that is the whole picture. And yet this illustration here in Revelation 2 and 3 would suggest none of us has the whole picture. David?
The different perspectives of different churches, they need one another to fully understand who God is.
So would you resist the question, which of these churches is right? I think so, right? Yeah. I like to put it this way. This scripture helps us to understand that there's more than one right way to think. And I think when you grasp that, it changes the way that you relate to other Christians. Because when you think there's only one way to think, and you think that you've got that way, then if I am right, you are wrong. And I think what this tells us, each of these churches was very right. And yet each of these churches had only a partial picture. And I think this is really powerful. I read these texts for decades and never saw that. and how powerful that picture is. But it truly causes me to feel humble in the sense that however clear or however helpful a picture I may have of some of these things, it's only partial. It's only, as Newton said, and if anyone had a right to think he understood the whole ball of wax, it was Isaac Newton. And as Newton said, I feel like a child playing with pebbles on the seashore while the whole ocean of truth lay open before me. If Isaac Newton could say that, then all of us, I think, should say that. Yeah. So each church gets a different picture of Jesus. What does that teach us? Why can't each church have a partial picture and it's all the same so we can be united? What about that? Why does God give each church a different picture? Perhaps God does that because we needed it. David?
I think also it speaks to the fact that we need to be willing to learn from one another instead of judge each other's perspectives, to be primarily learners so that we can better define the character and nature of who God is. I think it also emphasizes to me the absolute necessity, in Hebrews 1, where it talks about Jesus being the exact representation of his being, that the starting point for understanding who God is to really study and look at the person of Jesus. He didn't come here, as this gentleman said earlier, to become humbled. He came here showing us, hey, I'm the most powerful and the most humble being in the universe.
Okay, Gary?
If we're going to be learning and studying God throughout eternity, then obviously we're never going to have the whole picture in eternity. So how can we expect to have the whole picture first century AD? Secondly, can you divide God into 7 aspects? I mean, it's infinite. So just the idea that you divide them into 7 and you have the whole picture just by if you have all those 7 together. So that doesn't make sense to me.
All right, Terry.
Doesn't learning from and with each other and others and communicating with others build community and relationship? And isn't that what God seems to be working towards so much? Building a family, a community of people who work and learn and play and love together?
Mm-hmm. Bob?
I heard a story from someone who was on a committee for a church, and somebody in the committee who felt very strong-minded on a point said that they'd prayed about it and God had revealed to them the truth. And somebody else said that they'd also prayed and just the opposite answer had come. And so what happens is you have a contest of who's the most vigorous speaker in the committee. And I mean, maybe they're getting a revelation. I don't know, because I wasn't there, but I heard the story. I'm sure it's been repeated more than once. But how do you know if someone's just very vigorous in their opinion or they're truly inspired?
Sounds like Fiddler on the Roof. Somebody makes a comment about the Bible, and Tevye says, you know what? He's right. And someone says, no, that's not right. It's the opposite. You know what? He's right, too. Then a third one said, they can't both be right. He's right, too. Joan.
When you ask the question, it reminds me of the talk you've actually given about stages, right? Different people in different stages relate better to a particular picture of God. And if you insist on giving them this one picture and they're either not prepared for it or they're not there yet, then you've lost them altogether. So I think there's a part of that too, is knowing your audience and what they're ready to accept and learn, and then just giving maybe someone else something else that they're more prepared for.
Jesus even said, I have many things to tell you, but you can't handle them now. Yeah. Dan?
Maybe going along with that comment, I think I've said this before, that people have observed that people can only remember about 7 things at one time. And it may be that God, in his wisdom, knew our limitations and said, I will just simplify it to these factors.
Of course. Points that some of you are making is the whole picture of Jesus in chapter 1 is still only a faint reflection of the actual thing. But it's a reflection that those reading Revelation at least are able to grasp in a nutshell. All right, we have John from Pasco.
I'm reminded at the epilogue to John, where he ends up by saying, there could be also many, many other things written, but it would fill the whole of the heavens with script. And as I've taught Sabbath school lessons over the years, I hesitate to say taught, as I've participated in Sabbath school lessons, I think the picture of God that I've grown to really admire a lot is that I believe that God is so big and so gracious that he can accommodate any picture that we have of him at whatever stage of growth we are, and he's not put off by it. He's big enough to handle it, even though I hope when I get there that I'm going to learn a lot more that may be straight stuff. But he's not that picky about what exact picture you might have.
All right, let's go to number 2 in your handout. And it says, the lesson pairs the second church, Smyrna, and the sixth, Philadelphia, of the 7 churches, because the messages to both are relatively positive. All right, so 2 and 6 are similar. The message to Pergamum, the third, and Sardis, the fifth, are both mostly negative. The message to Thyatira is twice as long as the others. This has led some scholars to see a 7-branch candlestick as the model for structuring the 7 churches. What would such an arrangement imply regarding the meaning of the letters to the 7 churches? Now, let me just go through that once again. Just imagine a 7-branch candlestick. You have like the central trunk and then 3 branches on each side. All right? And the idea is if the second branch and the sixth are parallel, and the third and the fifth are parallel, then the center point would be Thyatira, would be the middle church, would be the center, and it's twice as long. Now, the payoff of all of this is if it is true, then the last church and the first church are also parallel. And that will become significant at some point for understanding what Laodicea is all about. So what is this chiasm thing? What's this, the first and the last and the second and the next to last and so on? Well, Hebrew logic is a little different than ours. In Western logic, you say A plus B equals C, okay? And that makes perfect sense to us. The conclusion is what all the argument is leading to. That's Western logic. We get it. It's like the water that the fish swims in. It's like the air that we breathe. It's just part of who we are. But Hebrews didn't think that way. For them, A plus B equals A enhanced. It circles back to A. And A is enhanced. All right? So why is that significant? Because when you read a Western book, where's the climax? At the end. Everything after that is the denouement, your literature teacher said in high school. All right, so everything's moving toward the climax. But in a chiasm, it's different. A plus B equals A prime. Where's the focus of attention? Where's the climax? It's in the middle. And in the book of Revelation, the climax is in the middle, not at the end. And that so it affects the way that you read. A Westerner reading Revelation always ends up in the New Jerusalem. That's the goal. That's what it's all about. But when you read it in a Hebrew fashion, the middle starts becoming important. And it's not just me, or it's not just an Adventist thing. A Roman Catholic scholar, Elizabeth Fiorenza, did a very influential structure of the book, and everything went right down to the middle. But she took it a step further. She said there's a center of the center in the book of Revelation. And that's the three angels' messages. Well, it's the climax of the center part. And I think it's a very profound insight, actually. And I would take it a step further. There's a center of the center of the center. Within the three angels' messages, within chapter 14, there's a message that says, worship him who made heaven, earth, the sea, and the fountains of waters. At the center of the center of the center of Revelation is a call to worship God. And that worship 7 times applies to the dragon and the beast and the false prophet. Only 1 time is there a call to worship God, and that makes that the crucial message of the book of Revelation. It's a call to worship the only true God, the Creator, and the one who created a memorial for that creation, which is the 4th commandment. And Revelation 14:7 quotes the 4th commandment right at this decisive point. So I mentioned last time we'd come back to the Sabbath idea in Revelation, but this chiasm idea points the fingers at the center. Now, we do chiasms today too. It's called a piano keyboard. Have you ever noticed with the piano keyboard? Instead of just going somewhere, it's circling back. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you go back again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and back again. But as you go up the scale, the vibrations get more intense. So you're circling, but you're also going somewhere at the same time. And that's what Hebrew thinking is like. So God meets people where they are, and part of it here, he's meeting the Jewish mindset of the early church in the book of Revelation. All right, number 3. Read Revelation 2, 8 through 11. So while Terry is pulling that together, Dan has got a comment.
No, a question. Where did this chiasm idea come from? Is it Jewish in origin, or did it come from somewhere else?
It's very common in the Old Testament. You have the kind of a thing where it'll introduce something, then go to something else, and then circle back to the original point at the end. They're usually very simple, just 3 items. But you'll be interested to know it can be as much as 7. And I believe the book of Revelation is a 7-fold chiasm. You have the 7 churches, the seals, the trumpets, and then this middle part. And then you have the other side of the pyramid, if you wish, or the chiasm. But it's grounded in Hebrew logic. Just the idea A plus B equals A. You're circling back to where you started. And that's important. That's the way they thought. We are linear thinkers. A plus B equals C. So we're always going somewhere. And that's natural for us. So to some degree, we Westerners will misread the Bible, because we will tend to read it through the lens of our Greek logic. But sometimes when you do that, you miss the real deal. So I bring that out simply as, one reason Revelation is not well understood is it's definitely not written with Western Greek logic in mind. All right, chapter 2, verses 8 to 11.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death.
Why does Jesus come to this church as the one who died and rose again? Gerald?
They're a persecuted church. They're suffering. They're being killed.
They're being martyred, right? It says, be faithful unto death, I'll give you a crown of life, and you will be put into prison, and so forth. So Jesus comes to them as the suffering Messiah to encourage them in their suffering. And by the way, David, that was an interesting comment you made, when one could argue Jesus comes to each church because that's what they can handle. But you're suggesting he comes to each church with the thing they don't have. That's maybe different than what the typical scholar would say, but it's a very intriguing idea that he brings us what we need. What we need is not always what we want, right? So that would fit that. All right, so he comes as the one who died and rose to comfort those who are facing death, presents himself according to the need. In verse 9, it says, I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, that's pretty strong language here. Now, scholars will argue whether he's referring to Jews or Christians. The synagogue of Satan, is that a reference to literal Jews who are persecuting the church in this particular location? Or is it a reference to opponents in the church and calling them Jews or a synagogue of Satan? So the question is it referring to Jews or to Christian heretics? And that's debatable. But the question I think to consider is, why does Jesus take up such harsh language? When I talk about people that way, it's not good for me. It's very unhealthy. I'm not in a good place if I start railing at people like this. So why would that language be here? What kind of response is Jesus looking for in saying things in that way? Dave?
Is this kind of like Mount Sinai and the three angels' message, where it's get their attention and you have to be dramatic and forceful to get their attention because they're so noisy and focused on their own noise that they're not listening, and if they're not listening, they can't learn?
Mm-hmm. All right, so the suggestion is that language like this is designed to get our attention? Is that...
Emergency measure. If you don't get their attention, they're going to be lost. And so you do what you can to get them back on track.
Okay. Iris?
If I'm not mistaken, this is the only church that doesn't have any criticism, right? No critique.
Yeah, Philadelphia doesn't either, although it appears to be a weaker church, but also has no condemnation.
Is it possible that this church is as pure as a human church can be? And because of that, maybe this church experiences severe evil. And that doesn't leave God in a neutral position. When evil is really in full swing, in full bloom, God is not neutral. He has some clear words. And because he is God and not flawed like we, I think he can use this strong language. And I think in some ways that's comforting, that God does care in the face of evil.
All right, Gerald?
Well, I guess along with that, the strong language is not towards the church of Smyrna. It's towards those who are posing as Jews but are not. They belong to Satan. So it should be comforting to the church, because here's God saying, I understand these guys and I know who they are. Don't be afraid.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Julie?
It just hit me that Jesus doesn't talk about Satan very often, but he did once reference to Satan when he was talking about and to one of his closest disciples, when he talked to Peter.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So even a close disciple can be called Satan. That's pretty strong. Yeah, good point. So what was Jesus doing there? Well, we're thinking on that. Verse 10, very interesting comment. He says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you a crown of life. What's about these 10 days? This is perhaps, in many people's minds, one of the clearest indications that this is more than just local churches and local situations. A persecution of 10 days, I think most of us would say we can handle that. But if these are 10 symbolic days, it could refer to 10 years. And then people start looking, is there a period of 10-year persecution in the history of the church? And that leads people right to about the year 303, where an emperor named Diocletian made a decision that Christianity was fatally dividing the empire, and that the empire could only survive with the total extinction of Christianity. And he set about, up until that time, persecution had been sporadic and episodic in different places. But Diocletian, empire-wide, is determined to eliminate Christianity. And for 10 years, even after his reign, that persecution continued until in 313, Constantine replaced Diocletian and declared the Edict of Milan, which basically said that Christianity would move from being the disfavored to the favored religion of the empire. So Constantine drew the conclusion not that the survival of the empire depended upon the elimination of Christianity, but he decided the survival of the empire depended on making peace with Christianity. He saw the Christian faith as the future. And he said, if I want to keep a united empire, I've got to throw in my lot with these Christians, because that's where history is moving. So Constantine and Diocletian were not friends or anything like that, but they were in the same context, but they saw the solution to their problems very differently. So it's possible then that while this message is to a real church, to Smyrna, in a real city, one that you can even visit today, that the reference here is to more than just that local situation, but to a persecution that would last a whole 10 years and bring fear that Christianity would be totally wiped out. But Jesus says, do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. You know what? When I worry, it's usually about the future. I mean, I guess some people can worry about the past, but how can you worry about something? It's already there. So worry, I think, almost by definition, is directed to the future. And it's because we don't know the future. Therefore, we can worry about it. Well, how are things going to turn out? So Jesus, in the book of Revelation, takes the future in hand and says, I'm the one who guards that future. I'm the one who will be with you all the way. You have no reason to be afraid for the future. The lesson puts together Sardis and Philadelphia. So let's go to Philadelphia. That is chapter 3 and verses 7 to 13. And this is also a church that doesn't get any criticism.
And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these are the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. I know your works. Look, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but are lying, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you. Because you have kept my word of patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold fast to what you have, so that no one may seize your crown. If you conquer, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. You will never go out of it. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem that comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
All right, so here's the Church of Philadelphia. You notice it gets no criticism, but it is a weak church, because you have little strength. So Philadelphia is parallel with Sardis in the sense that it was Smyrna, in the sense that they are positive churches, but this church, to some degree, is a little bit weaker than some of its predecessors. Just an observation. In the first three churches, let's take a look at this. A little piece of this that's often overlooked. Notice chapter 2, verse 7. It says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I'll give the right to eat from the tree of life." Go to verse 11. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death." Each of these messages ends with a statement, whoever has an ear, and to him who overcomes. All right? Now notice verse 17. "He who has an ear, let him hear. To him who overcomes, I'll give the hidden manna." Now, notice Thyatira, verse 26. "To him who overcomes and does my will to the end, I'll give authority over the nations." And 27, 28, and 29, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." You notice something different? What's different? All right, the overcome message comes first, and the he who has an ear comes second. And that stays all the way through chapter 3. All right? So here's the observation. The observation is for the first three churches, it says, whoever has an ear, let him hear, to the one who overcomes, etc. In the last four churches, the one who overcomes, he who has an ear. Why? What could be going on there? Why does Jesus make this shift? Well, if you go through the messages, the first three churches have something in common. They are essentially faithful, but there's a minority who's not faithful. So the message of the first three churches is to everybody. The majority are faithful, so just sort of to everybody. But Thyatira is kind of 50-50. And then the last three churches, the majority are unfaithful. He's speaking to the faithful ones, the minority. So the shift means that the message, that he who has an ear in the first three churches is everybody. But in the last four churches, the appeal is only to the faithful ones. The others are not listening. So within the churches, there's a general decline as you go through the churches. The churches are getting weaker and weaker. It starts with Ephesus, where he says, you've lost your first love, and if you don't recapture it sometime, I might come and take another look at your candle. I mean, that's a really big threat, okay? But then you get down to church number 7, and he says, I'm ready to puke you out of my mouth. There's not a single good thing he can say about Laodicea. He just wants to throw up. So there is a downward trend in these churches. But I want to show you something else. There's an upward trend too. Notice chapter 2, verse 7. To him who overcomes, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. How many promises does that church get? 1. Okay? Tree of life. Go to verse 11. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. That's one promise. But there's a second promise in here. If you go back to verse 10, be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. So this church gets two promises. Notice verse 17. To him who overcomes, I'll give some of the hidden manna. I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. Three promises. When you get to Philadelphia, you get six promises. Him who overcomes, I'll make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will he leave it. I'll write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from my God. I'll write on him also my new name, piling them up. So the first church gets one, second church gets two, third church gets three, etc. Sixth church gets six. What does the seventh church get? 3:21. To him who overcomes, I'll give the right to sit with me on my throne. The seventh church gets the promise to end all promises. So you have a general decline among the seven churches, but the promises of God rev up from church to church and get bigger and bigger. What's the point? What's going on? What's happening there? What's the message? What does it tell us about God?
Infinitely gracious God.
Infinitely gracious God. Where sin abounds, grace much more abounds. Yeah, and you see that illustrated in these churches. Gerald.
He who has been forgiven much loves much.
That's right. So you see in the seven churches illustrated the fact that as our need increases, so the promises of God increase. You're never at a place where it's impossible for God to reach you. What then is the unpardonable sin? It's not God becoming unable to save us. It's we ourselves becoming uninterested in being saved. So the problem is never with God. We often think it is, but it never actually is. Now, the Church of Philadelphia has, by many, many Christians, been seen as representing the 19th century, the missionary expansion of the church. And we think of that as a glorious day of Christian mission, when mission went out from the Western countries and pretty much went to the ends of the earth. And you could see the gospel going to the world at the end of time seemed a very real thing in the 19th century. But I would add one other thing to it. We would see that as the positive side, but there was a dark side to that missionary expansion. And what was that dark side? It was colonial, yeah. In other words, the context in which the gospel could go forth was a context of Western military and political expansion, to where most of the world was ruled by Christian-based governments. Now, I would see God taking advantage of a political situation, etc., to provide a context in which the gospel could go forth. However, in today's world, that missionary expansion has become a serious blot on the Christian faith. In the West, Christians are ashamed of that history. And in the East, they're infuriated by it. And Christianity today, I think, is on a decline in the Western countries because people go back to that history with shame and say, well, Christianity expanded. Yeah, but it expanded with the power of the sword and the dangling of technology and cool gadgets and all the rest of that. So today, because of that, Christianity is seen in the world primarily as a political force and not as a spiritual force. So that's the dark side of the missionary expansion of the 19th century, is that the expansion was accompanied by the subjugation of the non-Christian religions of the world under the Western political domination. But then it's always to ask the question, what was God doing? God, I suspect, knew that there was a dark side to all of this. I think God would have known that. What is God doing today in the constant subjugation of Christianity. I mean, here you are in Western countries that are in name Christian, and yet the one religion that you can't speak positively about in public, until the Super Bowl anyway, the one religion that you couldn't talk about positively in public was Christianity. You could say nice things about everybody else, but Christianity is only negative in the press. I think God has his hand in that too, because for Christianity, for Christian faith to truly triumph in the way that Jesus would want it to triumph, it needs to lose its dependence on political power, lose its dependence on wealth and esteem, etc., and go back to the original, a movement that its power was in its willingness to not be all those things. All right, Joseph.
I grew up in Hong Kong, so back then it was a British colony, and you have to say something about the British, the way they run colonies. Usually they go there, build school, and then train the best of them, and they become civil servants. They become kind of like the ruling class of the British Empire, in the colonies. Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. But if you actually let the people of Hong Kong vote, if they can actually decide whether they would like to stay with the British or to be returned to China, I would imagine that they probably vote with the British. So I would say, as much as you bad mouth about the British, how colonialism compared to some of the governments that we have today, you probably still should consider is a blessing. I feel pretty blessed in my life. I have pretty much grew up with all Adventist education all my life, from Hong Kong to America. So I feel very blessed. And my father was principal of one of our church school in Hong Kong. And so I grew up in the school, and I had my high school in Hong Kong, and then I came to Andrews and Loma Linda. So I don't really have any complaint about my life. And maybe not too many people would agree that they have the same good experience with living in a colony, but different people may have different experience.
I think the point is that in every human situation, there is a bright side and a dark side. It's not just one way. And I think a tendency we have, and there's a fascinating, one of the really great statements of Ellen White in Testimonies, Volume 4, pages 9 to 11, where she talks about Christian histories and how we tend to write glorious histories of missionaries sacrificing for the Lord and so on and so on. But she says if the pen of inspiration were to write those stories, they would be very different. But even the brightest, most glorious stories that we would write are not accurate because there is a dark side. And she talks about the greatest things sometimes being done with impure motives and so on. And if the pen of inspiration were to write it, which is why the Bible is so balanced, because its greatest heroes tend to be very, very flawed people. And you get the whole story, both sides of the story. So you're absolutely right. There are some things you could look back at what the British did that were tremendous. At the same time, the British in Iraq faced an insurgency much like the Americans did, but they didn't battle it the way the Americans did. They battled it with huge brutality and completely crushed it, which we have never, as Americans, had the stomach to do. We've gone over there and said, well, we want to win this fight, but we're going to protect the women and children while we're doing it, which is sort of fighting with hands behind your back. So whenever you have political stuff, you have a bright side, you have a dark side as well. People are fighting for real ideals, but those real ideals are often mixed up with some very nasty motives. And one thing I was reading recently, there actually was a nation here before the colonies. It was the Cherokee Nation. And it was a real nation in the 1820s, when this country had states and everything was a real country. The Cherokee Nation was a real nation. And it had governments and courts and everything else. and was living side by side with the other. But Andrew Jackson, who came from that territory and became president, his number one mission was to get rid of the Cherokees and take that over for his people. And you've heard of the Trail of Tears, was when the Cherokees had to move to Oklahoma, a place that was very different from their homeland, but they were driven out. So we think of Andrew Jackson, many positive things about him, but then there also was a dark side. So I think whenever you're looking at politics, whenever you're looking at human activity, there's always a bright side and a dark side. And thus, I think when talking about religion, it is also helpful to say God is at work in every religion, and Satan is at work in every religion. And they're both subtexts of the cosmic conflict. So in the British expansion, God was working in that, and so was Satan. Yeah. Maybe in Hong Kong, you saw a bit more of the godly side. In Iraq, I think they don't remember, or in Palestine, they don't remember the British very fondly at all. Yeah. David.
God works with what he has to work with. And we live in a very broken world. What if Andrew Jackson had been a more just man, had seen the absolute atrocity of what he was about to do? Or what if people that were around Andrew Jackson were willing to risk their careers and hold Andrew Jackson accountable for what he was about to do? We live in a world where people have freedom to choose to partner with God and partner with the light or partner with the darkness. And whether you're political or whether you're in a religion or whether you're in a corporation, your choices for freedom and love and life and caring for others are important. And it's really important to hold those around you in whatever context you're working in, to hold them accountable. And as it says in Proverbs 24:10-12, if you don't, doesn't he who weighs the hearts know it? So yes, it is a political, a religious, a huge landscape, but really those landscapes are filled with individual people who can actually make individual choices to either open a pathway for good to come or open a pathway for devastation to come. And those are the choices that we each, in each of our lives, at all times are faced with in every moment that we live.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go to number 7, and we'll look at Laodicea here before we close. Revelation 3:14-22.
And to the angel of the church in Laodicea write, the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the origin of God's creation. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Therefore, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, so that you may be rich, and white robes to clothe you, and to keep the shame of your nakedness from being seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. I reprove and discipline those whom I love. Be earnest, therefore, and repent. Listen, I am standing at the door, knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to you and eat with you, and you with me. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
Laodicea was an interesting city. It was there for one reason and one reason only. It's the middle of nowhere. Seriously. It's sort of a valley in the midst of extremely high mountains, and it's nowhere. And yet there was a city of 300,000 people. There was. Today there's nothing. So what happened? A city of 300,000 people showed up out of nowhere and then disappeared. What happened was Laodicea was the intersection of the two biggest interstates in that part of the empire. And the one end of it was Ephesus, which was the harbor, and that was the prosperous city that all the trade came through and headed east-west. The north-south highway came right down through Laodicea. What happened was the harbor of Ephesus silted up in the years following the book of Revelation. And when the harbor moved, the highway lost its function. And when Laodicea was no longer the crossroads of the world, it ceased to exist. It no longer had an economic reason for survival. Laodicea, folk, had running water in New Testament times. There were pipes all the way under the city. You can go see them now. They had running water and sinks and everything, and toilets. It was amazing. Ephesus, you actually have the toilets. You can see them. And there was running water that was servicing them. It was an ingenious system. So they were quite advanced in many ways back then. Laodicea had a textile industry. Laodicea had made eye medicine. It was called Phrygian powder, and it was mixed with certain oils. So it was eye medicine. So in everything in this text, it's relating to the original situation. They had running water, but it was poor quality water. It was a crucial city that lost its reason for existence. It was wealthy and self-sufficient, but didn't see that doom was coming. It was self-absorbed and blind. Now, I want to show you something, which I think will put this into a fascinating position. Go to verse 17 and 18. It says, "You say, I am rich, I've acquired wealth, and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire so you can become rich, white clothes to wear so you can cover your nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes so you can see." All right? So here's the realities. Laodicea is naked. It's blind, it's shameful, and it needs clothing. Now that combination of four words occurs only one other place in the Bible. Any idea where? A combination of verbs of seeing, nakedness, shame, and garments. That combination of four terms occurs only once. It's the Battle of Armageddon. Didn't see that one coming, huh? I didn't either. It was just one day reading in the Battle of Armageddon. I said, wait a minute. I've seen those things before. In chapter 16 and verse 15, in the middle of the Battle of Armageddon, it says, "Behold, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes on him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed." The staying awake is the word for seeing that you have in chapter 3. In translation, you might miss that. So as a word for seeing, there's nakedness, there's shame, and there's keeping your clothes on. In the middle of the Battle of Armageddon, there's a call to God's people for faithfulness. And it uses the language of Laodicea. If Laodicea is the last church of Earth's history, here's the proof. Because in the middle of the Battle of Armageddon, the call is directed to Laodicea in the language of Laodicea. So Laodicea is truly the last church of Earth's history. But then the question is, if we see ourselves as being in that last period of history, if that is the parallel here, what is the message? What is Laodicea's problem? What is it that it needs above everything else? What's that? Awareness, okay. Authenticity. The big problem with Laodicea is it's inauthentic. It says, I'm rich, I'm increased with goods, I need nothing. But the reality is wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. In other words, what Laodicea thinks she is the opposite of reality. She's living in denial. So that's Laodicea's problem. What is the source of that problem? What's the core of that problem? What's Laodicea's need? Is it to try harder? Try harder to be poor? Okay. Here's where the chiasm comes in, bringing this thing full circle. What is the opposite end of the chiasm? Ephesus, the first church, and the last. What is Ephesus' problem? Ephesus' problem is clearly stated. Laodicea's is in symbol. Left its first love. Not lost. It's left. It's the same word as divorce. In other words, Ephesus has deliberately chosen to focus on behavior and to focus on criticism. They criticize the Nicolaitans. They don't have it together, etc. And they have left their first love. Laodicea is parallel to Ephesus. Is the solution to Laodicea's problem working harder? Is the solution more obedience? Or is the solution recovering that first love? You see, the chiasm helps to bring clarity to the message of Laodicea. The big challenge for Laodicea is the lack of love. And why does it have a lack of love? Because it doesn't have Jesus. Where is Jesus? Chapter 3, verse 20. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will go in and eat with him, and he with me. You know what Old Testament text that's built on? Song of Solomon. She knows. In the Song of Solomon, the king is restless one night. You remember who Solomon was. He had a really big palace with a whole lot of bedrooms in it, and each of those bedrooms had a different wife. And so when he's restless in the middle of the night, he's wandering the halls, trying to decide, where he's going to spend the night. And his favorite wife, first wife, love wife, many of the others were just political alliances, but the love of his life has given up on seeing him that day or that night, and she's washed up, taken her shoes off, gone to bed. And he knocks, and there's silence. He says, I've already gone to bed. Why should I get up again? I've already washed up. Why should I soil my feet on the floor? And while she's waffling there, he leaves and goes somewhere else. And she rushes out, finally opens the door, and he's gone. That's the background of this story. It doesn't bode well that Laodicea, in the end, has Jesus not there. The great need of Laodicea is Jesus. I find it fascinating. There was a little movement there, Jesus only, and it became very controversial. Why would it be controversial? Why would Jesus be controversial? Well, I guess he was always controversial to some degree, but why would he be controversial in this? Yeah, the devil doesn't want us to see Jesus. Jesus, the clearest revelation of God. That's the route to a clear picture of God. And yet Laodicea doesn't have it and is in danger of losing it forever. So this is a serious call. The message to Laodicea is a serious call that wake up, put your garments on, Go to the door. It's not going to be there forever. Now, Jesus came as the clearest revelation of what God is like, but he also comes as the clearest revelation of what we can be like. And that's what Laodicea needs. He comes with just what she needs. Let's pray. Lord, you have come to give us a clearer picture of what you are like, but also a clearer picture of what we can become like in you. May we see you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly. It's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.